the Health Marketing Podcast. I'm John Mangano. On this show, we explore the ways marketing helps improve patient health, usually with a focus on how we can achieve that goal through the evolution of marketing. Whether it's the channels we use, the strategies we employ, or even the tech changes that are always impacting us. And while that's important, we can't ignore the influence that legislative activity has on our highly regulated industry. While marketing and tech evolves, so do the very laws and bills that enable us to market. So today, we're looking towards Washington and going deep on the ever changing legislative landscape. Our guest is the perfect person to help us unpack it all. Jim Potter is the executive director of the Coalition for Healthcare Communication, a leading voice advocating for the free flow of accurate science-based health information. He's been at the center of the conversation for decades and can help us better understand the legislative changes being discussed today. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, John.
We're a show about the people, whether it's the patients, the providers, or the people in our roles who are working to make it happen every day. I would say most people probably haven't spoken to a lobbyist. So I think we'd love to hear about lobbyists and what exactly you do as a lobbyist in our world.
Yeah, I'm a lobbyist that was able to walk on two legs and walk out of the swamp. So I haven't formally been in DC for the last 10 years, but I've spent a good portion of my life there. So my first role really is to manage an association, the CHC, which is a subsidiary of the 4As. And so that's my primary role. Because we're an advocacy organization, I'm also a registered federal lobbyist, which is someone to help influence and shape federal and, in this case, state healthcare policy for our members. So whatever that intakes, sometimes it's meeting with key legislators or regulators, talking through. Oftentimes, it's helping frame and reframe where the industry is coming from, how it's perceived by policymakers.
So, what do you do for fun outside of being a lobbyist?
What do I do for fun? Well, I live in New England, so we have lots of mountains around us, and I have our pup. His name is Harry, Harry Potter, and he is the most famous person in our neighborhood. He walks around the neighborhood without a leash and drives all the other dog owners crazy, saying, "How do you do it?" And I go, "It's 90% him. I just keep him out of the way of cars." But we live here. We have four kids in New England. I like playing golf. I coach and have coached for the last, 10 years now, throwing sports in track. So it's a carryover for something I did in high school and college. But I enjoy that, and I keep getting asked back. Now they don't pay me anything, so that's probably why they keep asking me back. But those are some side things I like doing.
So, on top of being a lobbyist, you're an expert in throwing javelins and shot puts and
Discus is the main thing. I help with shot put, and we'll help with javelin. Yeah, that's just a side life that you start working with kids in middle school, just to coordinate. And now I've been doing it for almost 10 years. It's fun to kind of watch kids that you grabbed as sixth graders who are now have graduated or are there. And I think it's that familiarity and that trust level that they gained when they were very little. Said, "Oh, you helped me figure this out," or "You helped me kind of get through a tough meet, kind of calm me down, help me get my head straight." So that's very, very rewarding to kind of do that on the side. I used to do it when my daughters were in high school. Now they're all kind of have gone out, but I still get asked to come back every year and to help out, and it's generally by the kids, but we get along with the other coaches on the team. So it's fun, it's rewarding just to give something back to the community.
well, great. So, you've been here in our world for a while. What would you say are the three biggest legislative trends shaping and potentially influencing pharma today?
That's a great question, John. Thanks. There's actually what I would call four immediate threats impacting healthcare communication and marketing industry, and as a segue to the pharmaceutical industry. The first is the prescription drug ad ban. The second is the elimination of the deductibility for advertising in the year of spend. The third is what is for pharmaceuticals is the national security tariffs. And the fourth is a series of proposals, but the one that's kind of key interest is what's called a most favored nation policy to essentially lower the price of brand name drugs. So those are the four things with this new administration that are kind of really hot through the spring and into the summer here.
Well, let's go into this for. So first, let's talk about the advertising ban that's been discussed.
Sure. It's this really emanated back in the 24 elections when a guy named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was running for president. And he said in one of his rallies that he would issue an executive order on the first day in office to ban pharmaceutical advertising on television. Later on in the campaign, after he had kind of bowed out and Trump was the forerunner, late in the election, he said, Trump back in the White House and me in DC so we can ban pharmaceutical advertising. And the FCC chairman, Carr, and Elon, a guy named Elon, were supporting on social media this push. So that kind of really generated a lot of buzz coming in right into the elections and just after the expectations. I got a call from a friend. When you work in DC a long time, you have a lot of old friends. And came up and the day before Thanksgiving, he said, Jim, I'm working the transition, but not going to work with the administration. You need to know two things. First is we're lining up all the campaign promises and your issue. This issue is high on the list. And second, he told me, if you think it's just television, think again. So you've heard a lot of pronouncements in the last 6 to 8 months of, oh, if you just do this one thing, you'll get around linear TV and all your problems will be solved. What we know is that's not true. If you look at a couple pieces of state legislation that have on this subject that have been introduced, they're comprehensive ad bans. Everything is banned, literally. Any promotional communication targeting consumers. And that's similar to a bill that was dropped this last month by Senator Bernie Sanders that would ban any promotional communication targeting consumers. And it says, including television, radio, print media, digital platforms, and social media. So, again, a ban on everything. We've had a couple more state bills kind of come forward, but that is kind of the thrust of what has been driving this. And so immediately I went out and said, okay, I got to do my job and got others together to do the due diligence on what are the court precedents? What are the laws that have been passed in the last 50 years? What are the regulations that frame pharmaceutical advertising? And what I came back with was a real clear message is that, one, this is going to be really difficult to implement on any face. And there's a couple reasons for that. First, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, dating back to the 1970s, has viewed and ruled on advertising as a form of commercial speech. And they've ruled that banning advertising violates the First Amendment, number one. There is a procedure, what they call the Central Hudson test. And they said you can limit commercial speech when one of three things happens. One, it's misleading. And so that's the essence of all FDA laws and regulation. If you're misleading on your advertising, no, we can take that away. Second is when banning advances of substantial government interests. And probably the thing closest to that that's been used is what I would call is the ban or the semi-ban on tobacco advertising. But if you really look at it, while there's been some court cases, some of that or most of that is still voluntary by the tobacco industry. The third thing, and this is really what shaped legislation that's come forward in the last 40 years and the FDA regulations is that the government's interest could be advanced through a less restrictive route. And so when you think about that, think about a special label or the fair balance presented between risk and benefits. That's kind of the part of this less restrictive route. The other big thing that limits what the government or government agencies can do right now is a case that was decided by the Supreme Court last summer called the Bright Loper decision. And what that did is it overturned another doctrine, the Chevron doctrine, which gave agencies for the last 30, 40 years the ability to interpret what laws meant. They no longer can do that. So when they go astray of the direct language in a statute, then it's a much more likely probability that they'll be sued. So those are kind of the big things that are kind of shaping what goes forward. And the only major piece of legislation passed in the last 40 years is a thing called the FDA Amendments Act of 2007. And that basically introduced the idea of a major statement of risks that are conveyed in a clear, conspicuous, and neutral manner, or CCN. And those rules were just adopted over the last year and a half, just kind of came in. So it took some time between that legislation passing and the rules coming. There are other perennial bills that pop up for the last 20 years. One to a 3-year moratorium on new advertising or for newly approved drugs. The second would remove the tax deduction for advertising. And then the third would require some kind of price listing on all pharmaceutical ads. Now, each of those bills really hasn't gotten a hearing, hasn't moved, hasn't got a lot of co-sponsors. And so that's the biggest. The closest that something came of that was in 2019. And 2019 is important because that was part of the first Trump administration. And they tried to pass a rule through Health and Human Services that would require drug ads to, for price transparency. As soon as they introduced that, soon after it was blocked in the courts. It was a really bad piece of rulemaking. Most of the authority, if not all the authority, is in the FDA. And so they missed the mark. So what you've seen since the CCN rulemaking last November is some legislators, particularly in the Senate, saying, we like the CCN rule. It's great. Can you apply it to all other settings? And the FDA says, no, we really just have authority on television and radio. And they said, we'd like you to apply it on all digital mediums. And they said, nope, sorry, we can't do that. But what they have done is they've issued in the last year 6 what they called untitled letters. So it's a warning, not warning letter, which basically slaps the hands of the individuals. So there's been some social media campaigns that have only talked about the benefits of a particular prescription drug. And they've gotten a letter from FDA. You don't want to get these letters. So that is kind of what's shaping this. What we know right now and what's happened coming from this issue is right in mid-December, we put together information and talked about the Supreme Court precedents and the FDA and laws passed. And the idea was in the media that banning pharmaceutical advertising wouldn't be easily accomplished. And to date, in the last 7 months, I've done 35 national media and trade media interviews, done now 7 national conferences, and I've done dozens of kind of stakeholder briefings, literally dozens. And we brought together a kind of a broad-based group of broadcasters, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and then healthcare marketing interests. And we organize it essentially a legal challenge if one comes forward. And so 2 things, if what we've done is organize a legal complaint and a temporary restraining order. So should something materialize, and this is either it can be a rule, regulation, executive order, or even a piece of legislation. All those things, including state laws, which have a freedom of speech clause in each one of their constitutions, we would challenge those on the grounds I kind of talked about before about the Supreme Court precedents. So that's the most important thing for everyone to know is one, we have your backs, we're ready. We probably frame the issue pretty well. And I know this because of two things. One, in his testimony in May, now Secretary Kennedy admitted that prescription drug advertising is commercial speech protected by the First Amendment. And that same statement was actually in their first Maha report, which is probably why he remembered it and where he took it from. Secondly, FDA Commissioner Macri, in an interview a couple months ago, he says, "We don't have any plans to ban direct to consumer advertising, but there's some things that we can do to make sure that the information is presented in a more complete picture." So the important things to know kind of up to this date is no executive order, no rulemaking. This provision was not included in the big, beautiful tax bill. Although RFK Jr. is still looking for ways that he can try to end DTC ads. But if it emerges, what everyone has to know is it'll be immediately met by a legal challenge. The other thing that we're recommending is that that everyone follow these CCN rules across all digital mediums, and that's because we suspect in either this fall or next spring a Senate hearing where they're going to take these untitled letters, these people, and so we say apply CCN across all your omni-channel campaigns because you don't want your boss's boss to be part of this hearing to say, why can you do it like this on television, but you do it differently in social media? Tell me, why are you lying to the public? How are you trying to, how are you trying to hoodwink them? So that kind of frames up that issue. I'm sorry that I went so long on it, but it's important to kind of get that all out of the way.
Right, right. And it seems like um if you look at banning DTC advertising, and then the second piece of it, which is removing the tax deductibility for advertising. And I've been in the space, I've been in the space for a while, and I did not realize that it was tax deductible. Um, but it seems like there is we'll call it a distaste by legislators towards DTC marketing. And what is driving that?
Well, I think it's a little bit of the Maha movement. Those who probably it's a lot of advertising in certain segments, particularly the news. Um, I met with a particular news company, and after a 90-minute kind of interview where they're peppering me with questions, they said, about 40% of our revenues in the evening come from pharmaceutical related advertising. And they said, if this would come forward, we would be crushed. Now, they then, after peppering me with a lot of questions, asked for my presentation. And I'm pretty sure that this information got back channeled to the White House and the administration. So this broadcasting company, which will go unnamed, is my new best friend. But I think that's part one. I think it's also related to pharmaceutical advertising, the amount of money they make. So it's also kind of let's go, take a chunk out of people making lots of money. And so you've also seen some what I'll call proxy wars going on in DC. So pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, have been a big target for Congress, and they've been in and out of pieces of legislation. They also got, opted out of the one big beautiful bill at the last minute. So they've been doing for the last year and a half this proxy war between pharma and PBMs, spending millions of dollars in advertising going after each other, trying to frame the other one. And so that's what you'll hear a bunch in Washington, D.C. There's a group that's kind of a leftward leaning group funded by the PBMs. I affectionately they're called the Campaign for Sustainable RX Pricing. I affectionately call them the Crispies. And they're kind of leftward leaning like the Crunchies, but they want to burn pharma So I call them the Crispies. You got to have a little bit of fun with what you're doing here. So that's a little bit, but none of these provisions. The important thing is we met with the tax writers on the Senate side, both minority and majority staff in May, and we talked through this issue. And they told us, thanks, this is really too complex for us to take on. And they said, second, if we identify one business sector to eliminate this advertising deductibility, and you can deduct for all your advertising in the year of spend. Um, and bottom line, they said, if you go after one, you go after everybody else is on the table. He said, so small businesses will be outside our door in a heartbeat, thinking they're the next ones. And for small business, this is make or break for many of them, this deduction. So that's the tricky thing about trying to say, okay, one industry doesn't get this and the other industry. It's been on the books since 1913 when personal income taxes and corporate income taxes were incorporated. So it's a long-standing provision. It's always brought up because there's budget savings attached, and the CBO says if you eliminated, or actually if you amortized half of the spend over 5 to 10 years, then you're talking somewhere between 83 and 177 billion dollars in 10 years of savings. So it's a big number. It's an attractive target. It always comes up. But ultimately, I just think it's too tied in the way that all businesses kind of do. And it's a driver of what they do.
It's not a unique thing for pharma. Advertising is a tax deductible expense for any business. So every car ad that we see, every meta ad that Zuckerberg puts out there, none of that is being taxed, right? It's not some weird advantage that pharma gets for doing it.
Yeah, no, there are some state proposals, and to tax digital advertising that have been floated and tried, but no, this is the deduction that's been very, very clear. It's been on the books for 120 years, and so what the other thing that we do is we work with a group called the Advertising Coalition. And on at least a biannual basis, they put together a study on the economic impacts of advertising at both the national, state, and congressional districts. So every time we do a Hill visit, we walk into the congressman or woman's offices and say, okay, this is how many people that the advertising industry employs in your district. This is the economic impasse in your district. And then we give them the state and the national numbers too. And when you look at that, the thing that stands out is like 20% of all jobs are related to advertising in the US economy. So it's a big economic driver.
All right. So then if we look at kind of the drivers for these, and the first being the idea that we should ban advertising, it's because I don't want to call it this, but some may perceive it as a nuisance. Although, I think those are the lucky ones because that means they probably don't have the conditions being advertised. So in some ways they should be thankful. But they don't want to see as many ads, but we all know advertising is funding the news at night. So if not pharma, then someone else, or there's no news. Then it's the money, right? Because pharma is a profitable industry. And go to the next level. It is expensive, as all of us have when we pay for our drugs. We wish it could be cheaper. So let's go to the next point that you brought up, which was the national security tariffs on pharmaceuticals. What exactly is that?
Yeah, this is something that you hear more in kind of the steel and aluminum sectors. And so there's a lot of laws and a number of precedents that say if an industry relies extensively on foreign production. And in this case, they named two sectors pharmaceuticals and essentially computer chips. And it probably will be broader than just computer chips. But if they rely on this, same as steel or aluminum, and to a limited extent, automakers, but it also applies to everything's defense related. So there's a ton of precedents that they could use. Now they're applying it to pharmaceuticals, and they typically, when they go through this rulemaking process through the Commerce Department, they can take up to 270 days for a comment period. They took 21, which ended back in May. So we anticipate some kind of rulemaking coming forward. And again, this is essentially, it's a very, very broad definition. It's anything that you can make that's related to a prescription drug and the ingredients or the resources for that. So they're going to do a study. I think Secretary Lutnick said that by the end of this month, end of July, he expects to have something out. Now, that could be just a report. It could be the outline of a rulemaking. But we think something's going to move forward, and we think the industry is really taking it serious because 7 of the major pharmaceutical manufacturers have pledged $214 billion to reshore their businesses or resources in the US. That's a big number. And that's over the next like 3 to 5 years in these estimates. So they're treating it, and I think they're doing this to try to inoculate themselves through this process. But I think there's going to be some negotiations. There's probably going to be what I think will be a written waiver. So every company says, okay, we're going to pledge this. And in negotiations, the Commerce Department says, yep, okay, that's good. And in return, we'll give you a waiver for this time, from any tariffs, any national security tariffs. I think President Trump last week said that he was like thinking of the number 200% tariff on all drugs made internationally that were being imported. That's a big number. President says a lot of things to throw out in a headline to grab attention. But I think the thing here, what it will come down to, and this would be probably our next threat, what it kind of melds into, is the administration is going to have to choose this year. Do they want to reshore this, or do they want to try to depress the price of brand name drugs? And I think what the pharmaceutical manufacturers are really thinking is like, we can do one or the other, but we won't do both. Because if we don't both, there's no margins. We can't do this. And so we won't do the national security tariffs. We'll make stuff abroad and we'll accept the tariffs, and the American public will pay for it. So I think they're going to probably say, well, in this negotiation, give us some time or give us a waiver on all other tariffs, probably is what's going to happen. I'm now given this presentation this broad presentation to 2 pharmaceutical companies because their lobbyists and their execs can't talk about this publicly. I can, and I think our thinking is aligned because they're allowing me to talk in front of all their employees. And so it's probably consistent of what they're looking for in these national security tariff negotiations kind of moving forward.
Right. And I guess that makes sense for national security that, we're a large population and to a degree shouldn't be dependent on other countries that might deny us access to what we need to make our population healthy.
And we really saw this during COVID, where you saw a lot of supply chain interruptions. So my guess is the big number that already pledged is because a number of these companies were already thinking about that. So it made it easier for them to kind of make those kind of commitments, maybe, bump them up so they looked reasonable. But I think it was already in the offing in a lot of pharmaceutical executives' minds to reshore some of this manufacturing.
Right, right. Then that makes sense. But of course, most of why things are done overseas is because it's cheaper. So if we look at the causes and the concerns around the topics we've just discussed, right? Okay, there's too many ads; it bothers people. Okay, the next level is it's expensive and farmers making a lot of money. It's a security risk, so let's bring it back in the U.S. But that's going to make it more expensive. So then, um, let's talk about uh, the world with PBMs. Does that then become where they go after to get, because ultimately it's a market, so there's going to be a demand curve and a supply curve, and at some point we're going to meet. And ultimately we want to have unlimited supply as a country, right? To make sure everyone's as healthy as possible. How do we balance the expenses and ultimately the increased costs if we onshore it?
Again, it's probably a decision point of what the administration wants to be successful with this year, and doesn't mean like 3 years or 4 years from now they don't try something different. I think the PBM reform proposals that I think have been scored at like $12 billion. I think those are real. Those are impacts on pricing in this country. I think those reforms are likely going to be passed in some form or another. We'll see what Congress does with them. Ultimately, it's going to have to be congressional action. The other thing that has been bandied about by the last three administrations is this most favored nation pricing policy. And basically, in May, the Trump administration or the president set out a new executive order to that would essentially require the U.S. to pay the same price as a nation pays for its lowest brand price in a peer economy, and essentially think like Western Europe, probably Japan, um, and but the problem with that, where there's a benefit to that from kind of a consumer standpoint, this Congressional Budget Office said that last year that this most favored nation proposal would have the largest reduction, more than 5%, they said. I've seen other estimates that would take this up to 15%. And this is just talking about brand name drugs. So, it probably means that this is on the average price of drugs. So it could be like 25, 30% hit on brand name drugs if this proposal went forward. The problem with this is there's not really laws backing it up. Given the Supreme Court precedent, I talked about the Bright Loper case, they're going to have a difficult time even doing demonstration projects. The Obama administration tried it. The first Trump administration tried it. And they were sued in court and lost during the first Trump administration. The Biden administration thought about it, probably developed something, and then said, we're not comfortable with the way this is. And we're just going to implement the Medicare price negotiations. So that's what we're going to focus on. That was under the Inflation Reduction Act. So the details since May have been loose. They said what's going to be on brand name drugs. Two things. Can the administration find some kind of viable legal authority first? The second thing is, can they have the discipline to execute it properly? And this administration, based on the first administration, has had difficulties. They'll often skip steps that make them more liable to legal challenges. And so I think the most favored nation policy probably would require some new legislation. And it would have some cost savings. If they wanted to pass it, it would have been part of the one big beautiful tax bill. It wasn't included either. I don't know how seriously they're going to talk about this. They all these issues, the calculus here for federal policymakers is okay. Do we put forward a proposal that gets struck down in the courts? Because if it gets struck down in the courts, we don't get to talk about it for about 5 years. And if you look at the 2019 price transparency rulemaking, nobody talked about that for 5 years. So it was kind of taken off the table for a while. So do they want to be able to talk about these as a political rhetoric point to try to put voluntary pressures on this, keep the pressure up throughout the administration? That's my guess. So if I had to be a betting person that said, okay, what's the most logical thing to do this? I think they implement the national security tariffs to go after the reshoring effort, which everyone agrees is not a bad thing to do. The pricing and how to lower the prices, That'll be more of a voluntary activity, and we'll see what comes out. But right now, there aren't the laws in place beyond the Medicare price negotiations. That is having some impact. But beyond that, there's really not good law to support doing that at this particular time. So that's what they kind of have to figure out.
Yeah, yeah, and the pharma and healthcare is such a complicated industry. So there's a lot of information and misinformation about the impact of pharma ads, and I personally have done a whole lot of research that shows most often, it has a positive impact. Sometimes, if not done correctly, it doesn't, like any marketing. But for the most part, more people are healthy after seeing pharma ads than if those pharma ads didn't happen. So, I guess my question is, what hurdles are you seeing being created? And since you talk a lot with brands and others who are doing the advertising, uh, what might it be doing specifically to help or hurt our ultimate goal of getting people to be healthier?
One thing that I've noticed since coming into the industry, and it's really funny because these are all marketers, is as an industry, we don't talk much about ourselves or what we do or why we got into the business. And that really kind of struck me as odd. It's probably there on the surface, but but we don't talk about it. So I learned a lesson in my advocacy career is if you can get 60% of the stakeholders repeating your message again and again and again, ultimately you win. We did this for breast cancer detection and treatment. I did it for a thing called infant hearing screen, which is the number one congenital birth defect. When you get everybody repeating the same thing, good things happen. So what we've done is we've developed now 14 facts about the healthcare communications and marketing industry. And they go through things going back to one of our old topics that, banning DTC ads would have little or no impact on the average price of drugs. CBO did an estimate last year and they said zero point 0.1 to 1% reduction in the average price of drugs if you banned everything. And so, one, that kind of reaffirms like, no, you're not going to get a lot of cost savings from this. There's a lot of assumptions mandated about. The other thing that we don't talk about well is the good that we do. So, for the last 40 years, you've seen a lot of promotional campaigns, advertising that remove stigma associated with humiliating conditions and diseases. And that's routinely done. They're often unbranded ads. And that information gets to patients and helps get them into doctors. And ultimately, what all these talking points center around is really enhancing the discussion or the joint decision making between patients and their practitioners to get to better health outcomes. So that's our primary goal in all this. And I think, it will be evolving here as the industry goes forward because of the CCN rules to have more complete information. But I think we need as an industry to keep repeating these 14 points, and we'll probably add to them. Something like this isn't static. We get better references every day. The perceptions that I've learned from some recent studies is that physicians now, back in the early aughts, turn of the century, about 50% said, yeah, we think healthcare advertising or drug advertising helps. Now those numbers are into the mid 90s. So, the old perceptions are no longer relevant. And physicians say, yeah, because they come in. And then when you think about other newer mechanisms like point of care marketing, where you're working with a hospital or a healthcare practice and you're bringing the right information together at the right time about the diagnosis and treatment, physicians don't have, or other practitioners and PCPAs don't have a lot of time. And so the more information that the patients bring to them to that setting, the better typically the outcome. And the more that there's buy in by the patient on this is probably the best approach for me, given what I think I can do and how I can, how compliant I can be. That's another point is like advertising helps compliance and adherence by anything that you're doing. So all these points, these are things that we should be probably talking about all the time. If we're not talking about them, nobody else is talking about them. And if we don't talk about them, then the voices of Maha, who oh, we're annoyed, ban it all, burn it all, those voices will win. So that's where you have to have a counter message that everybody can repeat.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to frame it up too, because if you think about it, unless you are in the healthcare environment, um, if you're no longer in school, if you're doing whatever you do, whether you're building houses or advertising outside of pharma or anything else, you're not really learning about conditions because you're it's just not what is in your world. And so when you have a condition, you won't be able to spot it if you are not seeing things like ads. I mean, they fundamentally build that awareness to have people have the conversation. And some may have it when they don't need to, but that's okay because for all those who have that conversation, there's one who needed to, and it may have saved their lives.
When I was working in radiology and breast cancer, and I remember going through this, it's like, and we had talks with the NFL, and we brought the players union with us for these discussions, and we talked about things to promote breast cancer and the pink and whatnot. The crazy phenomenon is like all the teams were wearing pink, and it helped kind of drive that particular movement forward. And that's ultimately what you want to do is you want to bring other industries that can impact change in a condition. And so it's that marketing, either direct or indirect, that helps facilitate really major advancements in treatment, and oftentimes coverage and everything else that we expect to get better health outcomes.
So, final two questions. What advice would you give to a health and pharma marketer based off of everything that's going on in the market right now?
Usually, at most of my talks, I talk about three things. I talk about one, that the President Trump loves to impact various situations by leveraging and personal, professional relate. The second thing I talk to people about is RFK Jr. Is by his training, where he's made his money, he's a personal injury attorney. So if you kind of think about that and how he approaches issues, that the third thing I do is if you see any kind of proposal that would ban pharmaceutical advertising or limit it or do something else, um, I said, don't stop what you're doing. Continue to with the ad buys, because if you stop or interrupt, then you become co-opted. You become leveraged by what the president wants to do, and that's a voluntary thing. So the first thing is stand up because you need to know someone has your back, and if they try to implement one of these proposals, we're going to confront them in the courts. And I think we're going to win them. And so that's the number one thing. We've got your backs. Don't do anything different than you've already been doing, even if something emerges. Um, so I think and know that the First Amendment protects your ability to do advertising as a form of commercial speech. When you know those things, then you don't have to like be co-opted or bullied by the headlines that you see out there.
Great advice. And last question. If a legislator were to be listening to this conversation right now, what do you hope they would get from it?
I think, but they have to realistically draw for any attempts to eliminate the First Amendment right to commercial speech. If they're going to attempt that, they will be challenged immediately and vigorously in court, and they will lose. Um, and part of me, when almost wants someone to go out and to try to do something to make a mistake, so we can interject and we can take the issue off the table because you can't legislate being annoyed. You can't do that. We have laws. We're a nation of laws, and this is something that is really kind of secure. So, yeah, you can go do it, but I think that's why we haven't seen much movement because the messages and what we talked about, this information is real, concrete. Legal counsels agree with this, and so trying to do something like this is ultimately probably going to have a counter intuitive impact and do exactly the opposite of what you want for it to do. And so, again, that calculus by policymakers, well, can we, okay, we'll just talk about it. We still don't like it as a popular thing to be against this, to be against academia, things like that. And that's part of the MAHA movement, against medical journals. Yeah. So, yeah, it would be part of the rhetoric, but meaningfully, it really won't have an impact in the day-to-day decisions and kind of lives of our member agencies, companies, and medtech firms.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us here today. This has been very insightful.
Thank you, John, for having me. I really do appreciate it.
This has been Deep.